The air in the room was heavy before anyone spoke. A dimly lit boardroom deep inside a private club. Curtains drawn, phones confiscated at the door. The only sounds were the faint hum of the air conditioning and the uneasy shuffling of aides who knew they were about to witness something explosive. Whispers of betrayal had already circulated before the meeting even began. Tonight wasn't just another strategy session. It felt like a trial. Donald Trump leaned forward, his hands gripping the polished wooden table, his gaze locked on the young man across from him. The silence broke with a line so blunt, so cutting, it felt like a dagger tossed into the middle of the room. "Charlie, if you can't control them, I'll find someone who will." Gasps shot around the table. Aides who had been scribbling notes froze mid-sentence. One dropped their pen. For a split second, you could hear nothing. No breaths, no movements, just the weight of Trump's words settling over the room like smoke. Charlie Kirk sat rigid, his expression unreadable. His organization, Turning Point USA, had been Trump's youth army, the symbol of his reach into America's future. And now, with a single sentence, Trump had turned that alliance into an ultimatum. It wasn't the first time Trump had tested loyalty with sharp words, but something about this moment was different. This wasn't just Trump reminding someone of their place. This was Trump questioning whether Kirk still belonged in his empire at all. The tension was suffocating. No one dared to interrupt. No one dared to breathe too loudly. In that silence, one thing became clear. This was not just a meeting between mentor and protege. It was the opening salvo in a struggle over the soul of the conservative movement. And as the narrator's voice cuts in, the framing becomes undeniable. This was the last time Donald Trump and Charlie Kirk would ever sit across from each other. But what happened in the next 90 minutes would leave the entire conservative movement in shock. Charlie Kirk hadn't set out to be a rival. For years, he was the protege, the young firebrand who built Turning Point USA into a powerhouse of rallies, college tours, and viral content, all feeding energy into Trump's movement. To Trump, Kirk's youth army was proof that he wasn't just a politician of the present, but a force for the future. Every chant, every packed student conference, every viral video seemed to cement Trump's hold on the next generation. But by the time of that meeting, things had changed. Kirk's organization had grown so large, so influential, that it began to take on a life of its own. Donors noticed, students noticed, even members of Congress noticed. What had started as a youth arm of Trumpism was now something bigger, something less predictable, something Trump couldn't fully control. That was the context, and the stakes were enormous. At the heart of the confrontation lay three intertwined prizes: control of the Republican Party's future, ownership of the MAGA brand, and the loyalty of Gen Z conservatives. Whoever commanded those three would shape the next decade of American politics. And both men knew it. Trump saw the slippage. He could sense it in the way Kirk's statements had shifted. Less about Trump, the man, more about the movement. Less about loyalty to a leader, more about loyalty to an idea. For a man who equated himself with the brand, that was heresy. Trump believed he had created the river and anyone else was just a tributary feeding into it. The idea that Kirk could redirect that river, or worse, claim it as his own, was intolerable. Kirk, on the other hand, saw Trump as an anchor. For years, Trump's name had been the ticket to relevance, the magnet that pulled in crowds and headlines. But lately, it had become a weight. Scandals, indictments, and outbursts had started to alienate younger conservatives who wanted the energy without the baggage. Kirk knew that clinging too tightly to Trump meant risking irrelevance with the very generation he'd worked so hard to capture. His choice was stark: remain forever in Trump's shadow, or risk breaking free and building something that could outlast him. The emotional truth was undeniable. This wasn't just a strategy session. It was a tug-of-war over America's next generation. Every student in a Turning Point t-shirt, every viral TikTok, every campus rally was part of the battlefield. To Trump, those young voices were his insurance policy, the proof that he was eternal. To Kirk, they were the seeds of a future that didn't have to orbit around one man. And that tension hung in the room like a storm. Aides shifted uncomfortably as the conversation edged closer to confrontation. Trump's words grew sharper, dripping with the same mocking tone he had used to cut down rivals before. Kirk's silence was not weakness, but calculation. The quiet of a man weighing the cost of loyalty against the cost of independence. It was more than politics. It was survival. Trump was fighting to hold on to a legacy he feared was slipping. Kirk was fighting to prove that his generation wouldn't be defined by one man's shadow. Both understood the consequences. One misstep, one public fracture, and the headlines would write themselves. This wasn't politics as usual. It was a struggle for survival. Donald Trump had always styled himself as the kingmaker, the unchallenged monarch of his movement. In his world, loyalty was not just a virtue. It was a currency, a blood oath, and for those who dared break it, the punishment was swift and merciless. From the very beginning, Trump's rise was built on spectacle and dominance. Crowds roared not only because of what he promised, but because of how he delivered it. Brash, unfiltered, a man who seemed untouchable. Yet beneath the surface of that confidence lived an obsession: loyalty. He craved it, demanded it, and measured every interaction by how closely someone bent to his will. His story was littered with examples. Advisors who grew too visible were cut down with a tweet. Cabinet members who voiced the slightest disagreement found themselves humiliated, replaced, erased from the inner circle. Friends became enemies overnight, and allies were cast aside the moment they showed independence. Flashbacks painted the pattern clearly. Who could forget the mocking nicknames? Little Marco, Lion Ted. Even his most loyal soldiers, people who had sacrificed reputations to defend him, were never safe. Jeff Sessions, the first senator to endorse him, was reduced to a punchline after recusing himself. John Bolton, once his chosen hawk, became a sick puppy the moment he criticized him. The message was always the same. Loyalty was a one-way street, and only Trump set the terms. And yet, here lay the contradiction at the core of his persona. He proclaimed himself the champion of free speech, the warrior against censorship, the man unafraid to say what others wouldn't. But when dissent surfaced within his own ranks, it was treated as betrayal, not dialogue. He preached strength, but ruled by paranoia. The closer one stood to him, the more dangerous the position became. His circle was never a family, never truly a team. It was a revolving door of usefulness, where people were measured by their ability to amplify his image. If they faltered, they were discarded. If they shined too brightly, they were dimmed. The great irony was that Trump, who projected total confidence to his followers, was driven by a deep fear of disloyalty. Every ally was a potential threat, every rising figure a possible usurper. And that fear was only growing. The movement he had birthed was now too large to be contained by one man forever. Whispers of succession, of generational change, echoed louder each year. Trump knew it, felt it, and resented it. He wasn't just fighting Democrats or the media anymore. He was fighting time itself, clawing against the inevitability that movements outlast personalities. The meeting that night was just another chapter in this saga of control. Around the table sat men and women who owed him their careers, their followings, their entire political identities. Trump leaned on them not for advice but for affirmation. He wanted nods, applause, obedience, and he expected Charlie Kirk, once the eager young soldier, now the head of a youth army, to fall in line like always. But Trump's paranoia bled through every sentence. His jabs weren't casual. They were warnings. Every word about Kirk's generation was laced with condescension. Every laugh an attempt to keep him small. Trump had seen too many protégés turn rivals, and though he wouldn't admit it out loud, he could sense the restlessness in Kirk. This was the villain archetype in its purest form. Not a cartoonish evil, but a man who believed domination was survival. He had spent decades sharpening that instinct in business, in television, in politics. To him, loyalty was not about trust but about leverage. Keep allies insecure. Keep them dependent. Keep them reminded of who holds the throne. And as the meeting wore on, Trump's tactics became clear. He mocked. He interrupted. He cast Kirk's successes as small compared to his own. He reminded everyone at the table who built the movement, whose name still filled stadiums. It was the same playbook he had used for years. Isolate, diminish, control. Yet there was something different this time. The arrogance was still there, the obsession with loyalty just as sharp. But beneath it all was a flicker of unease. Trump could feel the ground shifting under him. The students Kirk rallied. The social media ecosystems Kirk controlled. The donors who whispered about the future. They were all signals that power might not be permanent. So, Trump doubled down, louder, harsher, more domineering than ever. It was the only language he knew. Crushed doubt with force, drowned dissent in bravado. But what he didn't know, what no one in that room could fully see yet, was that Kirk's silence wasn't submission. It was calculation. Trump believed he was scripting another performance of dominance, another chapter where he reminded the world that he alone could command the stage. But the stage was shifting beneath his feet. And Trump wasn't the only one with a hidden agenda that night. Charlie Kirk sat in that conference room, outwardly calm, hands folded neatly, his expression giving little away. To Trump's allies, his silence might have looked like deference. To his critics, weakness. But silence can be a strategy. And in Kirk's case, it was the silence of a man weighing every word, every move. As though he knew this meeting would one day be remembered. Kirk hadn't always been in this position, facing down the man who once served as his political North Star. His story began in cramped college auditoriums and half-empty ballrooms. He was barely out of his teens when he started touring campuses across America, a wiry figure with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, carrying little more than a microphone, a conviction, and the certainty that he had something to prove. Those early days were thankless. Students mocked him, faculty dismissed him, and audiences often numbered in the dozens rather than the hundreds. But Kirk fed on resistance. Every protest against him became proof that he was striking a nerve. He was young, unpolished, sometimes clumsy with words, but he possessed the tenacity of someone who couldn't be ignored. Out of that tenacity grew Turning Point USA. What began as a shoestring operation, a couple of laptops, a logo, and an unyielding message, transformed into a sprawling network. Kirk turned rallies into recruiting grounds, memes into megaphones, and social media into a weapon. He built an army of students who saw themselves as rebels on their own campuses. What the left dismissed as noisy theatrics, Kirk molded into infrastructure. And then came Trump. For a young activist trying to push into the mainstream, Trump's rise in 2016 was more than an opportunity. It was a lifeline. Kirk tethered his movement to Trump's momentum. Suddenly, Turning Point USA wasn't just a scrappy grassroots outfit. It was part of the new conservative wave. Kirk became a fixture on cable news, a regular at rallies, a face photographed behind Trump at rallies and White House gatherings. But with proximity came dependence. Kirk's power swelled, but so did the perception that he was little more than a loyalist. Trump's messenger boy rather than his own man. Each new endorsement, each cheerleading soundbite, each appearance in Trump's orbit tightened the tether. The brand of Turning Point USA became inseparable from the brand of Trump himself. Behind closed doors, Kirk wrestled with that reality. He wasn't blind to Trump's flaws, the bombast, the pettiness, the endless feuds. He saw what others saw. But he also recognized the cost of saying so. His movement, his career, even his identity, had been braided into Trump's success. To pull free too quickly risked unraveling everything he had built. So Kirk chose patience. He played the loyalist role even as doubt gnawed at him. He told himself the timing wasn't right, that there would be a moment when he could pivot without destroying the movement he'd nurtured. That internal struggle wasn't merely political. It was personal. For years, Kirk had carried the weight of expectations, from students who saw him as their voice, from donors who poured millions into his cause, from a conservative base that treated him as the bridge between generations. The loyalty wasn't just to Trump. It was to those who had believed in him when he was a kid with a microphone and no money. To walk away felt like betrayal. To stay felt like suffocation. And so he carried both truths inside him. He was ambitious, driven, unafraid to wield power, but he was also conflicted, tethered to an older man's shadow while yearning to cast one of his own. This was the version of Charlie Kirk sitting at the long wooden table, flanked by aides and note-takers across from a man who had once been untouchable. Trump's voice thundered, filling the room, drowning others out, and Kirk listened, not because he had nothing to say, but because silence was armor. In that silence lived calculation. He measured every insult, every interruption, every jab about his youth army. He took it in, banked it like kindling, knowing there would come a moment when words, his words, would matter more than noise. Kirk had spent years learning how to bide his time. He had learned patience in the early days when no one showed up to his speeches. He had learned resilience when faculty and peers labeled him an extremist. He had learned strategy when donors questioned whether a 20-something could run a national organization. And now, those lessons converged. His quiet in the room was not surrender. It was a man sharpening his edge. The aides scribbling notes couldn't see it. Trump, puffed up with bluster, mistook it for submission. But to Kirk, this was the only way forward. To absorb, to endure, and to wait for the line that crossed too far. The insult that turned loyalty into betrayal. The push that left him no choice but to strike back. Because he knew it would come. And when Trump pushed too far, Charlie Kirk finally snapped. The meeting had already begun to fray at the edges. What started as a tense exchange of views now burned with the kind of heat that turns words into weapons. Trump leaned forward, voice booming, drowning out the quiet calm Kirk had managed to hold on to. "You think your little youth army matters?" Trump sneered, his hand slicing the air like a blade. "They're soft. College kids with Twitter accounts and slogans. They won't win battles. They won't fight like my people fight." Laughter broke from one of the older aides at the far end of the table, though it quickly died when Kirk's eyes cut toward him. Sharp, unflinching. Kirk straightened in his chair, refusing to be bulldozed. His words were quieter than Trump's, but that only forced everyone in the room to lean in closer. "My generation isn't soft. We're tired. Tired of being told to clap louder for you. Tired of watching movements rise and fall on the whims of one man's ego. Your time is ending. And my generation won't follow blindly." The words landed like sparks hitting dry wood. Trump shot back immediately, his voice rising, his finger jabbing toward Kirk as if it could pin him in place. "Ending? Let me tell you something. Nothing ends unless I say it ends. Without me, there wouldn't even be a movement. You'd have nothing." The aides shifted in their seats. One scribbled furiously on a notepad. Another glanced nervously toward the door as though escape might be the safer choice. The room felt smaller than it was, like the walls were leaning in, sealing them inside a pressure cooker about to burst. Kirk didn't flinch. He let Trump's words hang in the air, then pierced the silence with calm precision. Movements built on one man collapse with him. Movements built on people last forever. Trump's face reddened, his breathing sharp. He slammed his palm against the table, the thud reverberating through the conference room. A water glass trembled, the ripples spreading outward, a small but fitting symbol of the shockwaves inside the room. "You think you can replace me?" Trump roared. "You're nothing without my name. You're a shadow trying to outshine the sun." Kirk leaned forward just enough to show resolve. "Maybe, but even the sun sets." A hush swept over the room. Aides froze, their pens hovering in midair. One shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat, but no words followed. The temperature seemed to drop, though sweat still gathered on brows. The clash wasn't just generational. It was existential. Trump embodied the old guard, raw, bombastic, fueled by dominance. Kirk represented something quieter but no less dangerous, a calm certainty that time itself was on his side. Trump interrupted again, voice breaking into fragments of slogans, grievances, reminders of past victories. But the rhythm felt hollow, like echoes of speeches that once commanded arenas but now rattled inside four cramped walls. Kirk's responses cut sharper with each round, Not because he yelled, but because he didn't. "We don't fear you," Kirk said evenly, almost gently, which made the words sting more. "We're not impressed by the bluster anymore. We see through it. And soon, the country will too." A murmur slipped from an aide, half gasp, half sigh. Everyone understood the risk of speaking to Trump that way. But Kirk wasn't retreating. The exchange spiraled. Insult against defiance, bluster against composure, noise against clarity. The room became a stage, every aide both actor and audience, knowing history might remember this moment, or at least the leaked fragments of it. Finally, Trump leaned back, chest heaving, eyes narrowed into slits. The silence that followed was deafening. But silence in that room was never safety. It was only build-up. The narrator's voice, if one could have broken the tension, would have made it plain. The silence that followed was only the calm before the storm. The room was tense, thick with the weight of Trump's booming voice and Kirk's steady silence. For minutes, the older man had dominated the air, barking demands, listing betrayals, framing himself as the eternal sun around which everyone else must orbit. But then came the pause, that rare, fragile moment when Trump finally stopped speaking, his chest heaving, his glare locked on the young man across from him. The silence was suffocating, and it was Kirk's chance. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't match Trump's volume with anger. Instead, Kirk leaned slightly forward, his tone calm, almost unnervingly so. "Mr. President," he began, deliberately choosing the title out of respect, but also as a signal that he was about to say something that respect alone could not soften. "You think loyalty is enough, but the numbers don't lie." The aides froze. One slowly set down his pen, sensing that this was the moment they would remember. Kirk continued, each word deliberate, his pauses stretched just enough to let the gravity sink in. "Polling shows it. My generation is slipping away. Young conservatives are tired of fighting their battles in your shadow. They want something different. Something built on ideas, not just on a personality." Trump's face flushed, the red creeping up his neck. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but Kirk kept going, his voice unwavering. "Look at the rallies. They aren't growing. Look at the social media engagement. It's shrinking. Look at the energy of the base. It's exhausted. People aren't just tired of politics. They're tired of you." Gasps. Aides glanced at one another nervously, some staring down at their notes, others glued to the confrontation like spectators at a train wreck. Trump slammed his palm on the table, but the blow sounded hollow, desperate, more like an echo of power than the real thing. Kirk let the silence hang, then delivered the blow that made the room shiver. "You built a movement around yourself. I'm building one that will outlast you." It landed like a thunderclap. One aide dropped their pen, the sound sharp against the polished wood of the table. Another muttered under their breath, unable to contain the disbelief. Trump blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing as if words might come. But they didn't. For the first time in years, he was speechless. The weight of the line lingered. It wasn't just defiance. It was prophecy, a declaration that the era of personality cults was cracking under the strain of time. Kirk, sensing the power of the moment, leaned back slightly in his chair. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He let the silence do the work. Because sometimes silence is louder than shouting. Trump shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie, muttering about fake polls and loyalty tests. But the fire was gone. The aides saw it. The control he once wielded like a weapon slipped through his grasp, and he knew it. One of the younger aides scribbled something on their notepad. Not notes for Trump, but a reminder to themselves. This is the night everything changed. Kirk pressed on, softly but with razor precision. "You wanted loyalty, but loyalty without vision is a dead end. I don't want a dead end. My generation doesn't want a dead end. We want a future." The words carried not just through the room but through the ears of those who would leak them later. They were sentences designed not for Trump, but for history. Trump fidgeted, looking around for support, but found only uneasy faces. His dominance had been broken. Not by shouting, but by composure. Not by chaos, but by clarity. The aides couldn't help but react. One let out a sharp exhale. Another shook their head in disbelief. What they were witnessing was sacrilege in Trump's world, yet also something undeniable. Kirk delivered one final note, the kind of statement that closes a chapter with the weight of inevitability. This movement doesn't belong to one man. It belongs to the people, and the people are ready for something new. The silence that followed was louder than any chant at a rally. Trump's lips pressed into a thin line. His hands, once animated, now rested still. For the first time in that meeting, perhaps for the first time in years, he seemed small. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. Trump, rattled and uncharacteristically quiet, sat in the ruins of his own certainty. Kirk, steady and composed, had not only defended himself, he had planted a flag for the future. Outside, the aides would later say, the air felt different when they walked out of that room. Heavy, electric, like something irreversible had just taken place. Inside, the silence stretched, broken only by the faint scratch of a pen against paper, as one aide documented every detail. But the real explosion, the one that would ripple far beyond those four walls, the one that would shape headlines, fuel hashtags, and ignite a generational debate, was not happening inside that room. It was waiting outside, ready to detonate. It began with a text, a single message sent from an aide to a journalist. "You won't believe what just happened in that room." Within hours, whispers became rumors, and rumors hardened into headlines. The story of Trump and Kirk's explosive final meeting spread like wildfire, leaking from the closed doors of power into the bloodstream of the nation's political conversation. Anonymous aides, speaking in hushed tones, painted the picture. Trump red-faced, slamming his hand against the table, and Kirk, for once, refusing to bend. They spoke of silence so heavy it felt suffocating, of aides exchanging nervous glances, of a moment when the old guard collided with the restless defiance of a new generation. And in that retelling, the private showdown became public theater. By the next morning, Twitter was ablaze. Hashtags shot up the trending list. Trump vs. Kirk. The last meeting. Dignity over domination. Memes sprouted instantly. One viral image showed Trump roaring while Kirk sat calm, captioned, "The king meets his successor." Another depicted the Titanic with Trump's face pasted over it, colliding with an iceberg labeled Gen Z. The internet had done what it always does, take a private confrontation and turn it into cultural currency. Late-night comedy hosts pounced. Monologues opened with sharp punchlines. Apparently, Trump and Charlie Kirk had a meeting, and it went so badly that Mar-a-Lago has officially been declared a natural disaster zone. Audiences laughed, but beneath the jokes was a deeper recognition that something had shifted, something even humor couldn't disguise. Cable news followed with wall-to-wall coverage. Panels of pundits dissected every leaked detail. Trump loyalists railed against Kirk, branding him a traitor, a Judas who dared to question the man who made him. They flooded conservative airwaves with denunciations, warning that abandoning Trump meant abandoning the movement itself. But elsewhere, in the swelling corners of social media, a different narrative took shape. Younger conservatives began to rally behind Kirk, posting videos and messages that hailed him as a new standard-bearer. Finally, someone stood up, read one viral TikTok, viewed millions of times in less than a day. The divide was unmistakable. For some, loyalty to Trump was still a badge of honor, a marker of identity. For others, especially younger voices, Kirk's defiance became a spark, proof that the future didn't have to remain tethered to one man's ego. The ripple effect stretched further than anyone predicted. Donors whispered about shifting their money. Student organizers at Turning Point chapters debated openly whether they still needed Trump at the helm. Journalists described the moment as a fault line in the conservative movement, a fracture exposed for all to see. And through it all, Trump seethed. He released a statement calling the reports fake, branding Kirk as weak and disloyal. But the more he attacked, the more attention Kirk's stand received. The Streisand effect had taken hold. Every attempt to bury the story only fed its reach, amplifying the narrative that Trump had finally been challenged from within. For the audience watching from afar, immigrants, workers, students who knew what it meant to confront arrogance with dignity, the spectacle resonated in ways that transcended politics. It felt like a story about courage, about the universal struggle to stand tall against someone who believes power is permanent. It was validation, proof that even the loudest voices can be answered by calm conviction. By the end of that week, the meeting was no longer just a story. It was a symbol. Commentators called it the generational split, the end of blind loyalty, even the quiet beginning of a new movement. The nation wasn't just gossiping about what had happened. It was imagining what it meant for the future. And yet, as much as the world seemed to know, one truth remained hidden. A revelation no meme, no leaked text, no anonymous aide had yet revealed. The biggest shockwave of all was still waiting beneath the surface. And when it finally surfaced, it would leave the country in disbelief. The meeting that had begun in whispers and ended in silence carried a weight far heavier than the words exchanged. In that room, the air was thick with history, with the clash of two worlds colliding. The old politics of fear and spectacle against the rising voices of a generation that demanded more. What played out was not simply a disagreement between two men. It was a symbol, a mirror reflecting America's crossroads. Trump sat as the embodiment of yesterday. Loud, unyielding, convinced that loyalty could be bought, demanded or threatened into submission. He believed power was eternal, so long as fear was strong enough to hold people in line. But across from him, Kirk represented something different, even unexpected. For years he had been molded in Trump's image, an echo of the movement's most divisive instincts. Yet in that moment, his calm defiance hinted at a new possibility, that the torch could be carried forward without the shadow of one man's ego dimming its flame. The contrast was undeniable. Trump's bluster cracked, his interruptions sounding less like authority and more like desperation. Kirk, for once, did not bend, did not retreat. His voice was steady, his words sharpened not by anger but by resolve. It was dignity meeting domination, and for perhaps the first time in years, domination blinked. The lesson was clear. Movements that tether themselves to personalities eventually fracture under the weight of those personalities. They consume themselves, leaving little behind but ashes and regret. But movements that live in the hands of people, diverse, determined, forward-looking, outlast even the loudest voices. They are not monuments to egos, but bridges to futures. This was not about liking or disliking Kirk. It was not even about Trump's latest demand for loyalty. It was about a generational shift, the recognition that fear can roar for a while, but courage whispers longer. And in that room, courage whispered in a way that could not be ignored. For immigrants, for workers, for students, for anyone who has felt that politics was a stage built only for the powerful and the arrogant, this moment carried a message. The stage can be remade. New actors can step forward. The script can change. And while Trump left that meeting convinced he could still command obedience, history will remember something else. It will remember that dignity rose to meet domination, that arrogance faltered when confronted by calm defiance. It will remember that the true revelation was not in the clash of insults, but in the simple truth that courage does not need volume to be heard. This wasn't just a power struggle. It was the moment dignity rose against domination, and what happened next would show just how deeply those ripples would spread, far beyond the walls of that room, into the heart of a nation still searching for its future. And so, as the dust settles, we return to the story that began behind closed doors. Donald Trump and Charlie Kirk. The last meeting revealed. What started as a clash of egos became something larger, something symbolic. It was never just about one conversation or one room. It was about a turning point in America's political soul, a reminder that even the most powerful figures can be challenged, and that truth finds its way through the cracks of arrogance. This story is not only theirs. It belongs to us. It belongs to every immigrant child told to stay silent, to every student who questioned authority, to every worker who refused to bow down when dignity was at stake. What we saw in that final exchange was a glimpse of what happens when someone dares to break free from the shadow of fear. Politics is always changing, faces come and go, but courage, the courage to stand firm, to speak up, to carve a future where justice is louder than intimidation, that endures, and it belongs to anyone bold enough to claim it. If this story moved you, if it stirred something within you, then don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel, share this video, and be part of a community that refuses to be silenced. Because together, we are writing the next chapter. One where arrogance gives way to accountability, and where conviction builds the kind of America we all deserve. This was Donald Trump and Charlie Kirk, the last meeting revealed. But beyond the headlines, the real revelation is this: power fades, but dignity never does. And in the end, that is the story worth remembering.